We'll leave Friday and come back Sunday.
Very fun.
Really dark.
Glad you can get away for a little while.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Those are the cars that you're like, crap, I almost pulled out Ryan.
Oh, I know what you mean.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
For Thanksgiving.
It's
I don't know where else that's.
Yeah. I think we're actually going over to the Hawkins house. There won't be there. Yeah.
Well, I always.
I don't know what it is, but I know what it is.
There is that color.
But
He was ready to do it. It'll come.
yeah, I know.
On my way.
Oh, yeah, really.
Hey.
But this is the time when I start wanting to church.
All right.
Maranatha. Yep, here we go. That was that ding.
Are we live?
I don't know, you just dinged me.
Are we live? We are live.
I'll turn my,
We're ready to go.
I'll turn
Welcome.
my ringer off now.
Good evening. Glad to have you back again on a Wednesday night. It is wet, rainy, but it's good to be here. So we're glad you came, and thanks for just coming, sticking this out, and continuing to have some discussions together. So just a reminder, no class next week, Thanksgiving break, so enjoy a week off, and then we'll come back and do another 3 weeks, and then we'll be off for Christmas for a couple weeks, and then we're getting pretty close to, knock on wood, no, we don't believe in that, but knock on wood, we're getting close to the end of Genesis 1 through 11. So probably in January, I'm guessing we're going to be done with that. So just kind of working our way through it, and then we'll talk more about what we're going to do after that. So yeah, thank you for coming. Let me pray, and we'll begin. Lord, we thank you for this evening, and we thank you for the privilege and the blessing it is to meet together. We thank you for each person that's here and for their desire to grow and to learn and continue to make progress in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So we pray, Father, that you will teach us and pray that you'll instruct us. We pray that the things that we talk about tonight will be pleasing to you and edifying to one another. And we just pray, Lord, that you'll continue to transform us into the image of your Son, making us more like Christ and carving sin out of our life and increasing us in our likeness of him. So, Lord, we thank you for this time of year as well as we remember Thanksgiving and all the ways that you continue to shower your kindness on us. We are humbled and thankful for the many blessings. We acknowledge they come from you. So we commit our evening to you now in your name. Amen. All right, we're on page 8 of last week's notes. So if you do not have those notes, you're going to have to either share with somebody, or Cheryl might have a few copies. So if you do need last week's notes, you weren't here, come grab some, because we need to finish our notes from last week, and then hopefully we'll dive into tonight's notes. Stop on page 8. I want to what 8. Let me again. And deal with man. Part is still verse 20. And then we to the verse that tells us God's promise that everything is going to remain as it is until the end. So we talked last week about remaining season, summer not going to change, and then day and night shall not cease either. So this is God's promise that everything will continue as he has ordained it until things are destroyed and we have the new heavens and the new earth. So that raises the question, by the way, we don't know for certain if there were seasons prior to the flood, or if that came as a result of the flood. We're not quite sure. It's possible either way. There may have been some seasons prior to the flood, but if you have a greenhouse effect and a canopy of water, perhaps there really wasn't much change in the climate at all. When then for certain seasons are going to begin. And so this promise in verse 22 is a promise of God's faithfulness to never let seasons or cycles of day and night cease. Which then brings us to the question and the issue of climate change. And I said last week, just my favorite topic. Love talking about this. But I want to equip you. I want to at least give you a working knowledge. You can hopefully talk somewhat intelligently from a biblical perspective about climate change. And so we're going to dive back onto page 8 of the notes for last week. And I do want to pick up there and just kind of give you a biblical framework for dealing with it. This is the hot topic right now, no pun intended. But this is the hot topic. And there's news articles. This is the main platform of the Democratic Party. Our current administration is all over this. I just saw yesterday a Fox News headline, maybe you saw it, of our former governor, Granholm, in a video about how evil gasoline is. Maybe you saw the video, and it's this kind of rap to how awful gas is and how we need to have electrical clean energy. And she shows up in a cameo, on this whole thing about the wickedness and the evil of gasoline and how it's dirty and how it's destroying our environment and how we need to move to clean fuels and all of that stuff. So this is just the popular thing. This is the thing to be talking about. It's been ramping up to this for decades. I just read an article today from 1979. And back in 79, they were dealing with this and they were talking about it. But what's interesting, do you know what was happening in the 70s? Early happening. They thought we were going another direction. So by the end of the 70s, talking about the decrease in temperatures, plummeting temperatures, probably again. So it's just crazy that 4 decades ago it was headed that direction. Now it's headed this direction. But this is the platform and the soapbox of the Democratic Party and those who tend to be on that side of things, the left side of things. So I want to help you kind of think through this. Page 8, what's the scientific mechanism for climate change? The supposed scientific mechanism for this. Secular scientists believe that Earth has existed for billions of years and that the temperature of the Earth has been stable for over 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age. And so with small observable changes in the Earth's temperature, these scientists now assume that humans must be the cause of this. And so the assumption within scientific circles today is this rise in temperature that we are seeing must correspond to humans' use of fossil fuels, which when burned give off greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, and ozone as well. All of that is contributing to the increase of temperatures. And so there are computer models now that are predicting out, decades and toward the latter part of the century and saying if this doesn't stop, then we're going to all die and the ice of the polar caps is going to melt and the floods are going to increase. And so this is the mechanism that they believe is what is causing all of this. And so their solution, as you've probably heard, is we have to not only reduce carbon emissions, we have to eliminate them entirely. And so it's not enough for them to say we have to kind of cut back. What you're going to be hearing increasingly is they have to be completely removed. We have to completely go to clean energy. And so this is the bandwagon and the the flag that they're going to be waving for quite a while. So I think President Biden is going to be in Detroit tomorrow. If I read something about that, he's going to be at some plant about EV vehicles, electrical vehicles, and so this is coming fast. And so that's their model. The model is this has been slowly rising. We need to decrease CO2 levels, which means you all need to stop breathing right now because you're adding to it right now. And so the way to solve this is to remove all fossil fuels and completely eliminate them. And I personally believe that that's going to commit energy suicide. That's just my personal conviction and opinion. But I'm going to show you why I think that's dangerous in just a few moments. From Genesis, so how do we think about this biblically? So from verse 22 of chapter 8, we know that God has promised to reestablish the cycle of seasons after Noah's flood and guaranteed that such cycles would never cease until the end of the present heavens and the earth. So how do we as believers respond to this claim? How do we deal with this claim that greenhouse gases are increasing the temperature and we need to, according to them, get rid of those? So how do we deal with this? What is a biblical way to approach this? And I said this last week. Is the temperature of the earth rising? Yes, minusculely. So is there global warming? Absolutely. I have no problem saying, as a believer and a Christian, that there is something known as global warming. I also believe in global cooling, which is not what you're hearing about. But you don't want to stick your head in the sand and say it doesn't exist, because that's going to make us look like we're just completely ignoring everything. No, I think the temperature of the earth is increasing, and I think there is some levels of climate change. The question and the issue we need to wrestle with is what's causing it. And this is where we're going to differ with secular scientists. As I just said, their conviction is man is causing it. You and I are the cause of this. Increased production, increased industrialization, increased use of fossil fuels is what's causing all this. So their solution is we have to stop that. I don't believe man's cause of it, but I do believe there is something called global warming. So let me give you some thoughts on this. Right in the middle of page 8, temperature measurements. Hey, do you guys need a paper in the back? Do you need notes from last week, or are you good? You're good, okay. Temperature measurements have been made since 1880 at land-based weather stations. These measurements indicate that there has been about a 1.3 degree rise, Fahrenheit, by the way, in temperature since about 1880. That might be explained by the heat island effect, where you have the buildup of urban areas around these weather stations. So the more concrete you build around weather measuring devices, the more heat is reflected off there. So it's possible that only explained by the increase of urban areas around us. Let me reiterate the point so there's no misunderstanding. The global temperature has been rising since the Little Ice Age. That is the nickname for what you can see at the bottom of page 8. This is gas based on there's data that show the last 2,000 years what we believe has been taking place with global temperature. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know all how they gather that data, but it's a pretty reliable estimate of the average global temperatures for the last 2,000 years. And so what I want you to notice is that around the early centuries, there back in 100, 200, there was what we believe to be what's called the Roman warm period. Temperatures were warm on the earth, warmer than other times of the earth. And then a few centuries after that, you have what's called the Dark Age period, where for a few centuries temperatures were below normal. So about the year 1000, a couple centuries outside of that, we had one of the warm periods. And then from about 1700 AD, I believe there was a significant drop to where you get to the 1700s, and they call that the Little Ice Age. And so we believe since about 1800, there's been a slow, gradual uptick in see the tree. So what I want you to notice is this is cyclical, right? There's times where the temperature rises, there's times where the temperature tends to go through these various cycles. I'll pull out this piece of paper that I handed out tonight to give you a little bit more of a close view. This is data that is actually very reliable because we believe that I think we began taking reliable temperatures back. We have data you can see from 1950, also gradual fluctuation in temperature. The way it was from an article that I don't know more about has a book reminded me of this recently. A book on politics, which I'm not very interested in. Very helpful sections that help navigate the topics. But where that chart is, you can see, in 1880, were a little bit warmer, then it will rise to 1930-ish. At 1970 is when 1980 very loud. There has been very little change 15 years. Flat last since 2000. You can see the middle tree. What I want to notice on the side of both change are we talking? We're talking very small changes. I mean, at this point, they maybe for Celsius over 20. When you hear about warming, climate change, you think swings in temperature don't think any amounts. Very small temperatures. 2003 Fahrenheit. Hardly nice. And go for we're not there massive change. 40 temperature. You do minuscule talking about very, very even part. Notice we'll go to the Little Ice Age around 1700. Let's call that different all the way to again a total of 0.8 degrees difference from the lowest point, Little Ice Age, up to plus 0.2. Still, we're only talking less than a degree centigrade, which is a degree and a half. We're not talking this one. Yeah. models. No, but computers that are projecting computer models, taking all that, they're projecting differences and those kinds of things. So now you have to question that what we're basing all of this on is just data. That's so hot on that. Talking about great question. Yeah, more than taking the views on this from science than they would be from God. And other than that, I don't know exactly how. But I think largely they would be more persuaded by scientific evidence than they are in trusting the sovereignty of God. I'm going to get into this a little bit. He's sovereign over the weather. He's sovereign over the time that we have left in this present heavens and present earth. He's sovereign over temperatures, and that he is marked out, as you just said. I think in the case of a Christian who would be bent, they're taking their cues probably where they shouldn't. That would be my concern.
Here.
Okay.
The live stream is messed up.
Is it not working?
It's pixelated. It's
Okay.
probably because of what you're talking about.
We got a guy who's on that.
Hey, Todd.
Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't their eschatology different from ours too?
Like more of a post-millennial or amillennial?
Probably,
Probably
Getting-
amillennial.
getting better, we gotta win the world and give it back to
Well, that would be
God.
post-millennialism.
Oh, is it?
Post-mill would say the world's getting better, or we need to make it get better through Christianization and the spread of the gospel and that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm not sure which one they would fall into, which either or post. But if you don't believe in a millennium, and you believe we're in the millennium now, whatever that millennium is, that would probably skew your view on these things. So our confidence, I'm going to get to this in a little bit, our confidence is that there is a future coming millennium where Christ is going to rule and reign, and so that gives us confidence that they may not have. So, good point. All right, back on page 9. So from this chart, it is reasonable to include that there has been normal climate variation of about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 2,000 years, and that the temperature has been in the neighborhood of the current global temperature twice before. So go back to the chart at the bottom of page 8. 2 times in previous history, in the last 2,000 years, we have been at these temperatures. So once during the Roman warm period, once during the medieval warm period. So it's not like we are in new territory here. If those numbers and that chart is reliable, then we've been here before. We've been here twice before. And there's been 2 times where it's been lower than this. So there's really no special cause required to explain the current global temperature. It's just cyclical. It's just doing its normal cycle of ebb and flow. And so that's how I would resolve or at least explain this issue. At the center of this debate is, as I've said, the belief that increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is the cause of the latest temperature increase. So you've heard that, you know that. You keep hearing about you need to decrease your carbon footprint. We talked last week about Canada. Remember, go back to page, in your notes from last week, page 6. Just turn back 2 pages. Remember what we saw last week, that yellow chart at the bottom of page 6. Canada is telling their citizens that the best way you can do to mitigate climate change is to have one less child. Because one less child across the country decreases the amount of carbon emissions, and you can do your part by saving 58.6, whatever those are, emissions by having one less child. So this is the absurdity of this whole thing. So the whole push is to get you to decrease carbon emissions. But notice the chart on page 9. There is actually not a correlation specifically between carbon dioxide and global temperature. And so the assumption in the secular world is as CO2 levels rise, temperature rises. As CO2 levels drop, temperature drops. But there's this chart here that I got, I think it was from an Answers in Genesis article on environmental science, where they're showing that while there might be some similar trends, there's no direct correlation. So notice what it says to the left of this. If you compare these CO2 estimates of these two scientists, the lack of correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide concentration is clear based on the best evidence we have. The global temperature declines significantly from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age. So again, the medieval warm period is 1000 AD. The Little Ice Age is 1700 AD. Notice the red line. So from the left-hand side of that chart over to about 1700 AD, that red line is doing what? It's decreasing. Global temperature is going down. What is carbon dioxide concentration doing in those exact years?
Increasing.
No, from 1000 to 1700, the blue line, what's it doing? Nothing. It's essentially flat. So here's the problem. Secular scientists are saying global temperature parallels carbon dioxide concentration, and yet we believe from 1000 to 1700 AD there's zero correlation because the temperature is dropping while what we believe are the CO2 estimates in those same years it's flat. So keep reading. In addition, the temperature rise beginning around 1700 precedes the rise in carbon dioxide concentration, which is not what you would expect if a rising carbon dioxide concentration were the cause of rising temperature. So again, notice 1700, you have a rise, the red line starts to increase, but for another 100 or so years after that, CO2 levels still are not rising. Now they do eventually, but what he's trying to show here is there's no direct correlation between these two. So that's probably a helpful chart for you to keep in mind, that no matter what they tell us, secular scientists, we don't believe there is a direct correlation between CO2 levels and temperature. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Middle of page 9, conclusion. It seems then that politicians and the media have always been concerned about the climate. In the late 70s, there was concern about global cooling. The temperature has declined for about 30 years, and many were convinced that we were headed for the next ice age. Almost immediately, the temperature started to rise. So from 70 to 2000, it continued to rise until about the year 2000. Early in the new century, so in the last 20 years, politicians were clamoring that the rise in global temperature was getting out of control and were blaming humankind for causing it. At the height of the concern about warming, it started to become obvious that the temperature increase had paused, and little change has been noticed now for about the last 15 years. In the absence of short-term warming or cooling trends which to panic, the politicians have turned to saying that weather patterns are much more extreme than in the past. Have you heard this? If you listen to any...
It's a crisis.
It's a crisis. There's storms, there's hurricanes, there's tornadoes. There's all these massive storms all over the surface of the earth, and they're saying that's because of climate change, global warming. And yet, they had to come up with something to keep the narrative going. But as this continues to say, the data is clear. The global temperature has been rising since the Little Ice Age, but today's temperature is not unprecedented. Based on the best information we have, it's in the neighborhood of the temperature during the medieval warm period about 1,000 years ago. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and therefore is a factor in determining the global temperature, but the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air and global temperature do not correlate well over the long term, indicating that carbon dioxide is not the dominant cause of today's rising global temperature. Very important. The globe is warming, but it's not your fault. And I think that's a good way to summarize this whole thing. Is there global warming? Sure. Is it your problem, our fault, humans' fault? Not at all. So my conviction is this is just normal cyclical change that happens every few hundred years, just kind of ebbs and flows and rises and falls. So if that's the case, what would cause that? Bottom of page 9, if we start with God's Word, we understand that the perfect climate existed prior to the flood. That existed prior to the flood was radically changed when the surface of the earth was destroyed during Noah's flood about 4,300 years ago. As the earth settled from the effects of the flood, there was a transitional climate during the Ice Age that covered 30% of the earth's surface in ice. That lasted about 700 years, and it resulted in a transitional climate that slowly gave way to the present climate as the earth evened out from the after effects of the flood. Thus, it would be expected that there would still be variations in climate and temperature. So what causes the fluctuations that we see? I think it's an after effect of the flood and the Ice Age. I mean, again, you can't underestimate or overestimate how massive the flood was. And then imagine 700 years of an ice age where 30% of the surface of the earth is covered by ice. What's going to have to happen over the next few decades, perhaps more than decades, centuries, and maybe millennia? It's going to have to level itself out, and it's going to have to stabilize. And I think you're still seeing that. Very slight, certainly not as it was in those years immediately after the flood, but I think that's what you're seeing. Thoughts? Questions? Buzz?
Why do they call it an ice age?
Say again?
Why do they call it an ice age if it's only like not even a degree? There was literally...
On the chart on page 8?
Well, the mini one is even cooler than the dark age cold period.
That's just
yes, page 8, yeah.
Bottom of page 8, the chart you're looking at?
Yeah, so like the dark age cold period, is that what they call the actual ice age?
No,
And
no,
then
the actual ice age after the flood is not represented
it's
on this.
before it's
Yep, it would have been like 1,600 years prior to this. So it would have been actually maybe more like 2,300 years before zero, the year zero. So it's not even on this chart. So what you see on the bottom of page 8 where it says the dark age cold period and the little ice age, those are just nicknames given to those dips in temperature.
Okay.
But there wasn't an actual ice age at those times. I actually believe there's only one ice age after the flood. But secular scientists believe that there's been multiple ice ages, come and gone, multiple waves of it. I think there was only one ice age, the one that occurred right after Noah's flood. You're laughing, you're smiling. What are you thinking?
As I think about our solar system, our universe, how the planets are revolving around Earth, and do any kind of mapping of how things, gravity pulls and all of that, and we know seasons change because of the rotation of on the axis, and and how accurate is our measurement of our distance from the sun at any given point, and just a tiny bit of move away from or closer to the Earth as it rotates each time around every year. It just seems like there's too many variables to really say definitively one grouping, humans, are doing something like that.
Sure.
And these are the scientists looking at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And there's so many other factors. There's cloud cover. Cloud cover affects temperature. There's solar flares. Those can affect temperature. So there's so many other variables that come to bear on this. To isolate it and just say all humans are the cause of this is frankly foolish. But when you have an agenda to push,
Exactly.
and it's all about money, and it's about your cause and control, and it's about you pushing a liberal agenda, you're gonna twist anything you can to get it to say what you want it to say. So, yeah, Hannah.
Are they having a commotion about why human temperature is changing too? Like, haven't our bodies changed in temperature just as much as the Earth has, like right around a degree?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good question.
You think?
I mean, normal
have more of a
temperatures,
commotion about humans.
98.6 normal body temperature.
They don't care about humans.
Yeah, right. I don't know. I've not heard that. Is that an argument that they're making?
It is a little bit.
Really?
Yeah. I
My
don't think
sister's an
there's
MD, and when the kids did have COVID, and I was telling her the temperature, she's like, "Oh, 99.1 is like normal now.
Yeah.
It's like normal." Oh, okay. It's not
Interesting.
98.6 anymore.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Interesting.
I wonder if
Yeah.
that's because of the method that they're using, because I've heard with digital thermometers, you have to add
Oh, maybe.
a degree or something like that for you to get an accurate reading. But also, I think, just as we're all individuals, our normal might be slightly different than our neighbor's normal.
Of course.
Right.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Buzz?
I was just wondering, is it, I mean, bigger picture, one notch higher, is it the principality kind of thing ultimately, and man thinking they're in control of their own destiny and all these other things?
Oh, yeah.
The
I have
foolishness of it all.
Yeah, no, not.
I have no doubt that, Satan, Satan can have huge, massive influences when he infiltrates government. I think you see that in the book of Daniel. He was trying to infiltrate governments. So I'm not saying that all government is satanic. I'm not saying every politician is in. I didn't say that. But I have no doubt that Satan oftentimes will launch his greatest attacks or mechanisms through government, because then you can affect entire nation. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, and plus we shouldn't trust in government. I mean, even if Trump comes back in, that's not the answer.
No.
Yeah, we've got to wake up to that.
Yeah, good point. Rachel?
I was just thinking, I think I meant to say this last time, but I can't remember exactly when you said the Ice Age occurred after the flood. I don't think it was that long, right?
They think 600 to 700 years.
Okay.
It was quite,
Regardless.
but it's fairly short in terms of the whole
Right.
time scheme.
I just think it's cool that, like, the nation of Israel and, like, where Noah ended up was on the other side of the world, because the Ice Age only really took place in North America and Canada, right?
And Europe, northern parts of Europe.
But it doesn't, but it feels like wherever Noah was and his descendants, like those 700 years of descendants, they've kind of, because I don't know how you survive an Ice Age. Like, it's just, maybe I just have a bad view from movies, but it seems pretty severe. But I'm just saying, like, I think that's cool that Noah was in, the safer zone, or like the warmer climate,
Mesopotamia.
I guess. And so even though the flood caused this, worldwide ice age, we still are, the Lord allowed the earth to repopulate, and that people still moved, around, particularly first where Noah ended up.
Yeah.
And then spread out from there.
Yeah,
Anyway,
absolutely.
random.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Valerie.
Have you heard of the geoengineering where they're, China and other countries are trying to make their own clouds?
I have heard of that. Trying to create their own weather.
Yeah, trying to create that will help the climate change, they say too.
Yeah.
There's all these different theories.
Yeah.
We're missing something.
Yeah. So that's I'll say this here in just a few moments. You have billions and billions, perhaps trillions of dollars being thrown at this. And I honestly think this is going to affect poor people most severely. Because I was reading this week that fossil fuels are the cheapest and most abundant form of energy sources. Mm-hmm. And all this clean energy push is 2 to 8 times as expensive as fossil fuels. So that's great for the elites, and they can go spend $60,000 to get a new, nice, clean energy, plug in your car kind of thing.
Where are we going to go?
But most people around the world can't afford this.
No kidding.
So what you're going to have the poor people getting poorer, and you're going to actually decrease production.
Yeah.
Because it's going to become so much more expensive. You're going to have the poorer people that are going to be drastically affected by this. So they're just thinking minimize greenhouse gases. And I don't think they're thinking about the impact, the economic impact that this is going to have on third world countries, the poor in our country. So that, to me, is one of the main concerns, is they're just pushing an agenda and they're not thinking about the economic fallout from this.
And that raises the cost of everything else because the distribution of food.
Yeah.
And that hits them just as bad.
I mean, we're watching it right now, right? This $1 trillion infrastructure package, I don't know how much of that was for global warming, but you're going to have to pay for it somewhere. The costs are going to be passed on to the consumer. So inflation is going to increase, food prices are going to increase, because you're going to have a lack of production. The people that have done this for years are not going to be able to keep up with that. It's too expensive. So now you've got more people demanding more things with less people being able to actually fulfill that. And so you can see how serious this could get. Someone else had a hand up. Yeah, Elliot.
How can we take these graphs for any sort of accuracy if like all the data in them is just based off of the only collected data from like the last 200 years or so that they've been doing observational science and creating all these technology and models based off of just fairly recent information.
Yeah, so these two graphs that I pulled out for you are actually from creation scientists. These are not from secular scientists. So these are creation scientists who have the one I handed out tonight, that one's accurate because that's based on actual data. But the one on the bottom, page 8, as I said, I'm not quite sure how they estimated those things, but they have some pretty good resources to be able to even estimate what temperatures were like. I don't know what all of those are, but like I said, these are from creation scientists. So is there a little bit of guesswork in there? Maybe, but it's not entirely guesswork either. I have a better answer for you than that. Other questions? All right. So that kind of just gives you a picture. Top of page 10, therefore, it is obvious that man's recent activity is not directly responsible for global climate change issues. However, this is interesting. Listen to this. Man and his wickedness were responsible for bringing God's judgment of the flood that radically changed the climate. So in a sense, people who lived over 3,000 years ago are at least in part responsible for climate change because there had to be a flood, and then the effect of the flood was an ice age. But we shouldn't be overly concerned about climate change because it has been happening since the time of the flood. So the bottom line, is climate change real? Yep. But nothing's going to happen to this planet until God says so. And so that's our confidence. So I don't think any Christian should be stressing about this. I don't think you should be laying up at night. I don't think you should be worried about this. I don't think you should be concerned about this. I'll give you some reasons why in just a moment. But on the flip side, or maybe as a caveat, does that mean that we should be completely irresponsible? Does that mean we should not care about some of these things? Does that mean we should be flippant and callous and just go pollute and devastate rainforests and burn all kinds? No. There is another side of this, and the side of it I want to just briefly mention is we do need to be good stewards of God's creation. And so, top of page 10 here, a right understanding of climate change doesn't mean that we should disregard caring for God's creation, because God cares about what He has made, right? So God created everything that we see in 6 days. He rested on the seventh day. Psalm 104, let's look at some of these things that it says. He sends forth springs. He waters the mountains. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth, well, there's the man, but he may bring forth food from the earth. O Lord, how many are your works? And in wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. Does God care about what He created? Absolutely. Does He take an interest in it? Of course He does. Does it reflect His glory? Absolutely. So God cares about what He has made, and as His vice regents, which we are, we should also care about what He has made. So Genesis 1:28 says we were to subdue the earth and rule over it, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over every living thing that moves on the earth. So I think we have an obligation to be good stewards. That's the creation mandate. You have a mandate from the Lord to exercise dominion over His creation. So go hunt, go fish, go take care of the creation in the sense that you're being a good steward of what God has given to you. And so we should show equal care for all of God's creatures and all of His creation. We should show care for creation for our good and God's glory, because God is glorified when we show the same care for and delight in His creation as He does. So Dr. Barrick wrote a helpful article on this. He says that Genesis 8:22 implies that such preservation provides a model for mankind in His vice regency. So go back to Genesis 8:22. God promises to let there be seasons and cycles and days and nights. That's God's promise of preservation. And so what Dr. Barrick is saying, that model provides a model for us as we act as God's vice regents, that we should follow practices that contribute to the preservation of a stable environment. We should not act in a way that would cause unnecessary harm to the environment, that might result in some form of abnormal variation in the climate. Extreme deforestation without proper management and preservation of adequate forests exemplifies one abuse that needs correction. Air and water pollution should be kept to a minimum, even if neither has any substantial effect on global warming or global cooling. So I think we have to be careful we don't completely swing the pendulum either, right? So are we going to be concerned about global warming? Not in the least. But we don't want to swing the pendulum so far to the other extreme and says, well, it doesn't matter what we do to the environment. No, I think God cares about it. We should care about it to some degree, but we don't worship it. Romans 1, this is the problem of unbelievers. They worship it. We don't worship it. So we have to be good stewards of it. I think back, I wasn't alive in '69, but there's a pretty famous story about the Cuyahoga River in Ohio.
Yes.
It was so polluted that it
Caught on fire.
Caught on fire.
Can live there now.
The river caught on fire because it was so filled with junk and pollution that it actually caught on fire. That's not right. I think that's a violation of these principles. And even, we live in Belmont, just 6 miles, 7 miles that way.
Yeah, your water got.
And we still don't drink our tap water. We've been getting Culligan water service for the last 4 years because Wolverine Worldwide dumped PFAS in the river, and they're still dealing with cleaning it up. And we're getting city water sometime this next year. But that's an example of This is a company that didn't care. And the standards were different then, and we get it, and they've changed that quite a bit. So that's an example of where that probably shouldn't have happened. And we need to be better stewards of what God has given to us. So that's the caveat. Okay, thoughts on that? Questions?
I just want to make a comment that it's amazing that God created an earth that can renew itself too.
Yeah.
Like the Exxon Valdez, remember that tragedy?
Yeah.
Within just a few years, you couldn't tell that ever happened.
Yeah.
Gulf of Mexico, same thing.
Yep.
So God has created this miraculous earth that will take care of itself too.
Yeah, it's a
Oil-eating microbes. I mean, really?
Yep.
How cool is that?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think God, I'll say this in just a little bit, I think God built into the earth self-regulating processes that help it maintain its stability. Now, he's overseeing it all, but like you just said, there are organisms that eat oil. There's cloud cover that helps come in when it's too cold. And what does that cloud layer do? It acts as a blanket, and it heats the earth back up, and then it gets too hot for a while. What does that cloud cover do? It goes away. Well, that's not just happenstance. That doesn't just happen. God built a self-regulatory system to enable the earth to prosper.
Well, even like this summer, we went to the Smoky Mountains, and because of just the dense woods, all of a sudden storms will start, and it'll rain out of the clear blue.
Yeah. Yeah, so he waters the ground, it evaporates, it goes back. I mean, so he's built all of these cycles that enable the earth to not preserve itself, because he's the one preserving it, but to regulate itself. So that's why I have zero concern about global warming. So page 11, just a couple thoughts here. Reasons why we should not fear this. Number one, God is ultimately in control of everything. Of course, that's our confidence. We hold that high, the sovereignty of God. He is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. Psalm 148, verse 8 reminds us that he is in charge of the weather. And so he's completely sovereign over all the weather, every tornado, every hurricane, every bad weather storm that happens. He's in charge of all of that. In fact, I think it displeases God when we fail to acknowledge that he's sovereign over the weather. So we need to remember that everything that happens, every death that occurs by weather, every accident, that's his sovereign working. And then humans are not the be-all and end-all of what happens here on earth, because God is sovereignly overseeing everything within his creation. And then Wayne Grudem brings out something interesting kind of related to this. Do we really think that God would design an earth that is so fragile that humans can destroy it with a little bit of extra carbon dioxide? He uses the analogy in that book on politics about, would an architect really design a building that if someone came up and leaned against it, it would come crashing down? That's foolish.
Not for long. He wouldn't he'd be out of his list.
He'd be out. Speaking from an architect, he would know. So draw the analogy. Would God, who is the master architect, really design an earth that humans can destroy with a little extra production or burning fossil fuels? That's just absurd. It's actually more reasonable, as I just said, to think that the earth is self-regulating and that he's built processes within the earth to actually regulate itself. And I think that's what you see with cooling and warming patterns. I just showed you the graphs. Wouldn't a self-regulating earth with divine processes built into them demonstrate cycles of heating and cooling? That's exactly what we see. So we have to remember, number one, that God is ultimately in control of this. Number two, no one should be afraid. No believer should be afraid of this. If you listen to the rhetoric coming out of this camp, they are scared. They are afraid.
Yeah, they know they're lying, and they don't care. No, really.
They're really afraid.
But they legitimately are scared.
They really are.
They're fear-driven, just like the COVID.
Yeah.
Just like COVID.
I mean, they're scared for their kids. They're scared for their grandkids. As I said last week, they believe that a failure to deal with this issue is child abuse, because they're so scared of the effects of this long term on their family and their friends, that I believe fear is a major factor driving this issue. But as believers, we're not fearful. We don't be anxious for anything. We don't fear anything except the Lord. Number 3, as we've already said a number of times, God has promised that the seasons will continue. So he's promised to take care of the seasons and the days, and that will all continue until the new heavens and the new earth. By the way, think about this. In relation to the flood, he said, I'm never going to flood the earth again. What are climate change activists fearful of? A flood from melting polar ice caps. And God has already said, listen, you don't need to worry about this. I promise not to flood it ever again. So it goes right against the core of their philosophy. Number 4, top of page 12, our primary purpose should always be on people. So our primary focus is not the environment. It's not climate change. Our focus as believers is people. Because people are eternal. People need the Lord. People need Christ. That's what we need to keep pursuing as believers. We don't fear the things that really don't matter for eternity. We want to see people come to know Christ. And so in the short term, we also are concerned for policies. This is the quote there. Policies that may be perceived as good for the environment, but will have negative consequences on the poor. Instead, we put the poor first, and a likely result of such policies would be that once basic needs are met, those individuals will be more able to turn their attention to being good stewards of creation. So as I said, I don't think they're thinking about the impacts of this on the poor people of our world. And that's a major, major concern. Let me add one more that is not listed there. One more I just wanted to bring to your attention. Another reason why we don't need to be fearful is that God did not design earth so that we would destroy it by obeying his commands. I'll say that again. God did not design earth so that we would destroy it by obeying his commands. Here's what I mean by that. Genesis 1:28, he says, be stewards of what I've given you. Multiply, fill the earth, exercise dominion over it. So what's part of exercising dominion? Pulling fossil fuels out of the earth and using them for energy. So is God really going to design an earth, put us as humans in a position to be stewards of it and exercise dominion over it, go get the resources from the very world he created, and then have that lead to the destruction of the earth? That's counterintuitive, right? That goes very against God's very nature and his very design. So we don't think that God would set up the earth that we would destroy it by obeying the commands to develop the earth's resources and then use them for our benefit. So, yeah, Rachel.
Well, it's funny you say that because I was just having a conversation with a coworker about how her family is going vegetarian in 2022 because there's a lot of research now about eating meat, because of all the meat that we consume, it's what's highly contributing to the methane gases, which is what is causing global warming. So this is like a legit thing I've heard recently.
Yeah, because
people vegetarian.
When cows eat grass, they have consequences to that.
I got a comment about that. When Shiloh was a student at Rockford and she was taking a TV studio class, she went and interviewed Bill Steffen at Wood TV about climate change. And he said, yes, it's definitely happening, but he said many of the intensity of those storms you mentioned earlier, how they're getting stronger and more severe, he said a lot of that is a result of corn. People growing these gigantic farms out in the Midwest and the plains where they have these huge cornfields, and all that corn creates humidity as plants release that into the atmosphere, and that creates these supercell storms. So, yeah, it is. Storms are getting worse, but it's because people are more vegetarian than ever, I guess.
So it's not the animals, it's the corn.
Right.
Yeah, you can see how it just.
It's crazy.
I'm not saying it's wrong to be vegetarian, but.
But like the reasoning, because like what you said, that like God commanded us to have dominion over the earth and to use animals for
Right.
food, and so now that there's the narrative of like you need to stop consuming animals
Right.
because it's creating pollution. And
I remember
it's just fascinating.
And actually, this is a little preview. I don't know if we're going to get here tonight, but let me quickly go to Genesis chapter 9, verse 3, which says, "Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you." Every moving thing that's alive. Meat. It's your food, right? I remember seeing a bumper sticker once that said, "If God didn't want us to eat animals, why did he make them out of meat?" It's a good one. Cheryl.
They're focused on green energy. There are tens and tens and tens of thousands of acres of solar panels that are reaching the end of their lives, and wind turbines that are reaching the end of their lives. And nobody wants a nuclear reactor in their backyard, so where are they going to get this from? They don't even have places to scrap all these solar panels and wind turbines. They're shooting themselves in the foot.
Actually, you know where they're putting them? In the ground. I saw a picture of a massive...
That'd be a big hole.
Yeah, it's a massive hole where they're burying used solar panels in the ground.
Oh my goodness.
Does that not contradict the narrative?
Insanity.
Yeah.
And the useful life of a solar panel is roughly 10 years. It depends, a little more, a little less.
Yeah.
And the wind turbines is no more than 20.
Yeah.
I heard the blades have to be changed every 4 months.
4 months.
I read something like within the
4
past
months.
month that said
Wow.
4 to 6 months each blade needs to be changed out. So
Interesting.
what are they doing with the old blades?
Wow. They might be burying those as well. All right. Well, is that enough on climate change?
Yeah, that's enough. But this
No
was
more?
good.
Is that helpful?
Good. Oh, yeah.
It's fun. So at least that gives you an ability to kind
Yeah.
of think biblically about these things.
I thank you for
And
that.
absolutely, hopefully that's beneficial. Let's go to chapter 9. We have about a half hour, so let me get into chapter 9, and we'll see how far we can get here. So we come to chapter 9, verse 1. Let me just read that. "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So here we have this charge to multiply. Go back to chapters 8, verse 17. Just look up just a few verses above that. Verse 17 in chapter 8. "Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply in the earth." So all the animals leave the ark. God says, okay, those animals need to go be fruitful and multiply, repopulate the animal population. Now you come to chapter 9, verse 1, and notice who God's speaking to. He's speaking to Noah and his sons, and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And so here's a restatement of that command given to Adam and Eve. Well, given to Adam, actually, to be fruitful and multiply. Skip down to verse 7 of chapter 9, and he says it one more time. "As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it." So we have this charge from the Lord to multiply, to reproduce themselves. And interesting, in verse 1 of chapter 9, who's the charge to? It's to Noah and his sons. Probably meaning his sons are the ones, and their wives, that are going to be the ones that primarily fulfill this command. So here's a charge for them to repopulate the earth, which, again, just shows us that sexual relationships between a husband and wife are God's invention. So if you've been with us on Sunday mornings, we've been talking about
And
this.
Thursdays
And Thursdays?
on your podcast.
And Thursdays, yeah, I don't know why that's happened. Suddenly, everything recently is about sex. So here it is again.
Well, probably because what the world's saying all about it, we need to
We
know
need to hear
clearly
it.
what God has to say.
Yeah. So this isn't something we should be ashamed of outside or inside marriage. God has ordained it. He's ordained it within the marriage context. He encourages it and gives it to a married couple to enjoy for each other's fulfillment. So God doesn't blush when he speaks about this. It's very careful how he speaks about it, but he is unashamed to speak about it. Hebrews 13 verse 4 says, the marriage bed is to be held in high honor among all and to be undefiled. So here's a charge for them to repopulate the earth. This doesn't mean, I think, Hannah, you asked the question a couple weeks ago, does this mean everyone needs to marry and have kids? This does not mean that everyone should marry or that all marriages necessarily produce children. Rather, having children and filling the earth is part of God's plan for humanity as a whole. So you're going to have exceptions. There are going to be some people that have the gift of singleness, permanent gift of singleness, and they won't. There's going to be couples who try to have children and cannot have children. So you can't say that those people are being disobedient to this command. I think this is more of a command, in this case, particularly to Noah and his family, because there's only 8 people alive. So the charge to them is repopulate and fill the earth. And so now the question you have to ask today is, has the earth been sufficiently filled with people? And it has.
Not too many. We got too much gas. I mean,
gasoline or the clarify bar. It's adding to the methane problem again. Right? We knew what you meant.
Thank you.
So has the earth been filled with people? It has. And I think once this purpose has been fulfilled, the command is no longer operative. So I don't particularly believe that this is a command that every single person or every single couple has to obey today. I think it was a mandate given at unique times to Adam and Eve, to Noah and his family. The command has essentially been fulfilled. Now the earth has been filled with people, so I don't think that there's a mandate that you can say, if you don't do this, you are disobeying Scripture. I don't think we can go that far. But as I said a couple weeks ago, this is the norm for most people: get married, have children, etc. So, interestingly, only 100 years later, mankind would disobey this command. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And what'd they do at Babel?
Let's build that tower right
Let's
there.
build the tower and stay right here. So just 100 years after this, they were already disobeying this command. And I think at that point the command still would have been in place because the earth hadn't been filled. So Babel was just 100 years after the end of the flood. What about overpopulation? This is another topic that you hear kind of along the lines of global warming, and all of those kind of tend to be thrown together in the same category. Is there such a thing as overpopulation today? World's population today is 7.9 billion. So is overpopulation a serious threat to the world? If you listen to certain people, it is. Many fearmongers and doom mongers claim that population control policies need to be put in place and the population of the world should be reduced. So you have abortion being advocated for that reason. You have the one-child policy in China that advocates that for that reason. But this ignores the fact that many parts of the world are completely uninhabited and uncultivated. And interestingly, I found this week, 7 billion people could fit into the size of Great Britain with an average space of 350 square feet each. So there's plenty of space in the world. We're not having an overpopulation problem. There is plenty of room for everybody on the planet, and so we're not going to get on board with the whole overpopulation thing. Thoughts, questions? Yeah, Valerie?
My friend, he's an atheist, and he's really concerned about the billions of people on the earth and overpopulation. And he told me one time that he supports Planned Parenthood because of this. He's worried about there being too many people.
Very sad.
Brainwashed.
Yeah, it's very, very sad. And again, I think you have a lot of people that are fearful of this. Not believers, but you have a lot of people in the world who are concerned and are scared about this. And so abortion is not an issue. What kind of world are my children and grandchildren going to grow up in? All those kind of things that motivate these fears. All right, so let's come then to the issue of, maybe we can get some of this in.
The good stuff.
The good stuff. The having steaks for dinner.
Yeah.
So we come to verses 2 through 4. Let me read them. Bottom of page 1. The fear of you, God says to Noah, and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea into your hand they are given, and every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So we have a major shift right now at this point, post-flood, from what you can consume as food as humans. So before I do this, before I get into that, I do want to explain, first of all, animal relations after the fall. Before I get to human-animal relations, let me go back just a little bit and talk about animal relations. Because it's been a while since we talked about this, and some of this we didn't go into great depth last year. So prior to the fall, there was animal-animal harmony and animal-human harmony, because God originally designed the world very good. Genesis 1:31, there was no death. So there was perfect harmony between animals and between humans and animals. And we know at that point, pre-fall, that the diet that was assigned to humans and animals was vegetation, that they were vegetarian. So however long it took from creation to the fall, and as we said last year, I don't think that was very long. So from day one creation to the fall in Genesis 3, days, maybe a few weeks, but not long. I don't think it was a long period of time. But for that period, however long it was, all animals and all humans were vegetarian. Genesis 1:29 and 30. God said, "Behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree that has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I've given every green plant for food," and it was so. So he says it to humans and he says it to animals. Not technically, but he says it to Adam, who would have understood this. So to Adam and Eve, they've been given every tree which has fruit yielding seed for food, and to every animal, they were also given every green plant. It is possible that in the pre-fall environment, milk could have been used. That doesn't require death. Honey could have been used, because that doesn't require death. So that may have been included in a pre-fall diet. But all living creatures prior to the fall ate vegetables or plants. This means that even meat-eating animals today were herbivorous prior to the fall. So think about this. All your bears, all your meat eaters, pre-fall ate plants. And Isaiah actually looks forward to a day when that's going to return. So look in the middle of page 2. Isaiah speaks about the Millennial Kingdom, which in large part seems to be almost, not entirely, but a good amount of restoration of the Edenic state. So Isaiah 11 talks about the wolf dwelling with the lamb, the leopard lying down with a young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. The cow and the bear will graze together. Their young will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like an ox, and a nursing child will play by the hole of a cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. So Isaiah looks ahead to a future time period when the diet of animals is going to be probably exactly what it was in the Garden of Eden, pre-fall. So there's going to be in the Millennial Kingdom lions that eat straw. And actually, that's been seen even today. There was a lion that lost its mother, or I think the mother actually injured it and somehow disowned it. And so this family adopted this lion and young cub, and they tried to feed it meat, and they said every time they tried to feed it meat, it would puke. It didn't want it. And so they kept feeding it plants, and then a few years later they tried to get it to eat meat, and it wouldn't eat meat. So this is not unheard of. But when we come to that age, the Millennial Kingdom, that's what it's going to be like. And in verse 7, the lion will eat straw like the ox. So you have this pre-fall animal life that will likely be reflected in the Millennial Kingdom. Isaiah 65, verse 25, the wolf and the lamb will graze together, the lion will eat straw like the ox, and the dust will be the serpent's food. So again, we have this state that's described what that will be like. So a couple of observations about pre-fall animal life. Before the fall, many attack structures or defense structures could have been used in a vegetarian lifestyle. So the question comes up, why did God create bears with strong teeth and claws in a pre-fall environment if they wouldn't need those? Why would spiders be able to spin webs to catch insects or other things and eat them in a pre-fall environment? But we think that many of those structures could have been used in a vegetarian lifestyle. So spider webs can catch pollen for food. Lions don't need to eat meat. Panda bears even today have sharp teeth and claws but eat mainly bamboo. So it's not difficult to really understand how those structures could have been used even in a pre-fall environment. Added to this, number 2, God foreknew the fall, so he programmed creatures with the information for attack and defense features, so attacking other animals, which they would need in a cursed world, and then this information was likely switched on at the fall. So if God can pre-program your genetic DNA, your genetic material with things that come on at certain times in your development, then can he not program also animals that when the fall occurred, that those features then would take on more of a defensive posture or attacking other animals? So I think what you had then were all of that taking place pre-fall. So they're all eating plants. Top of page 3. Then I think it was the fall that obviously ruined animal-animal harmony and brought about carnivory. So I do believe that after the fall, animals started eating each other. Not humans eating animals, but animals eating animals. And I think the fall was probably the event that triggered that, brought about death, obviously. And so the fall likely marked a transition from herbivory to carnivory for animals. And actually, we don't know exactly when it probably occurred, but there's a hint in the Bible. I don't know if I would die on this hill, but let me share. So the question is, when did animals start eating animals? We know it was between the fall, and we know that by the flood, which I'll show you in just a moment, they were eating animals. Animals were eating each other. When did they start? I don't know. Again, here you can decide. Remember Genesis 4:7, where God warned Cain that sin is crouching at the door. And the word crouching there is this image of an animal that's ready to pounce and spring forth. And this idea of predator lies within that term crouching. So it is possible that God was using the metaphor of an animal attacking an animal to communicate to Cain the seriousness of sin. Sin is crouching at your door like an animal seeking out its food. Could be a stretch, but many commentators believe that could be a hint at pre-flood but post-fall carnivory. And we know that Cain killed Abel about 130 years after creation because Adam and Eve viewed Seth as the replacement for Abel, and Eve gave birth to Seth when Adam was 130. So just trying to read kind of some of these clues. When did animals start eating animals? Could have been immediately post-fall, but it could have been a transition over the course of time between the fall and the flood before that actually started taking place. But we know for certain by the time of the flood, animals are eating animals. We know that from the fossil record because you can see a couple pictures. One you've seen before, the very bottom one you've seen before. There is a fossil of a velociraptor and a protoceratops locked in mortal combat. So they were fossilized in that state. So unless they were just wrestling, he was probably trying to eat the other one. And the middle pictures, you can't tell very well, but that's actually a fossil of a Compsognathus, which is like a chicken or a turkey. And in its belly is a Bavariasaurus, which is a small lizard. And they found it fossilized inside of that creature. And so the picture on the right kind of shows you the fossilized structure. The upper bones show the predatory animal. The bones in the middle there show the animal that was eaten, and that is a fossil. So we know by the time of the fall, or by the flood anyway, that animals are eating animals. So that's just kind of a little background for you on that, but we know for sure that God did not allow humans to eat animals until this point, here in Genesis chapter 9. So again, look at verse 2. Genesis 9:2, the fear of you and the terror of you shall be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky. So here God says, okay, Noah, these animals are now going to be afraid of you. There's going to be a dread that exists between you and the animals, between people and animals. So why would God institute fear in animals at this point? One reason may be because, one reason for this fear was because man would be allowed to eat them. So obviously they're going to run. If they're going to be chased to be used for food, they're going to run. Another reason would have likely been to protect man from the animals, since the animals were greater in number, reproduced more rapidly, and were stronger. What happens if animals don't fear humans in a post-flood world? You've got animals probably populating more quickly than humans. What would eventually happen? What could happen? The animals wipe out the humans. So God institutes a fear and a terror between them to prevent that. Then you come to verse 3, where it says, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you, as I gave the green plant. So verse 3 is very important because what he's doing is he's hearkening back to Genesis chapter 1. Remember I read Genesis 1:29 and 30, where God says, okay, you're going to be given plants to eat. And now he references that here in verse 3. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you, just as I gave you the green plant. So God's saying, remember when I assigned you to eat plants? Now I'm assigning you the privilege and the opportunity to eat animals. And so he draws a contrast between the animal diet that they're given here and the previous plant diet that had been instituted way back in the garden. And interestingly, in verse 4, we find a prohibition. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So there's a parallel here between the original creation and this. So remember, God says to Adam way back in the garden, you can eat from what? Every tree of the garden, right? Except one. Mm-hmm. So very liberal. very free. God says, Adam, go enjoy. There's a cornucopia of fruits and trees and plants. Go eat anything you want. Just don't eat that one. And now we come to chapter 9, verse 3 and 4, and you have something very similar. Notice verse 3. Hey, Noah, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you. You see the liberality? God says, hey, Noah and your sons, go enjoy whatever you can catch and kill. It's all yours. You can enjoy every living thing that's out there. It's all food for you, except, here's the parallel, verse 4. You can't eat flesh with its life that is in it, its blood. So there's a prohibition. There's a restriction, kind of like the original. The original is eat anything you want, just not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Here the command is given, eat anything you want as well, with the prohibition that you can't eat flesh with the blood in it. So why is that command given? Why not the blood? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, Noah and his family could eat the animals, but what did the animals eat when they got off the ark? Because it was just flooded, and if they were like smaller, they probably couldn't take down a bear, and they had a fear of man, so they weren't getting fed by Noah's sons from like excess food.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're left to not. We don't know for sure because no passage tells us, but I think we have to believe that God, in His providence, sustained all of those animals on a boat for over a year with plenty of food for them all to eat and water to drink. And so I think God, in His providential wisdom, knows that these animals are critical to the expansion of the animal kingdom post-flood. And so I think that there's going to be God sovereignly overseeing this process. That's why He says back in 8:17, go be fruitful and multiply. So I don't think what happens is they jump off the ark, run off the ark, and the bear turns on the chicken and suddenly kills it and eats it. Because you need the chicken to populate. So I think God in His providential care just had a way of preserving that so that it didn't happen. That's a great question, though, because it doesn't tell us specifically in Scripture, but I think there was some providential control happening there. So,
Verse 4, the restriction is mainly referring to blood, right?
Yeah.
Just blood, period?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Nothing else but the blood.
The blood. Yeah, you can't eat the blood. So God was, this doesn't become...
And that becomes more in the Old Testament. It's referred to again later, right?
So it becomes very prominent in the Mosaic Law.
Yes.
Right now we don't have that. We'll look down, I put it in there, Leviticus 17:11. So we don't have the theology of this developed here in Genesis chapter 9, but is developed for us later in Leviticus 17:11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. So fast forward from Noah to Moses, God says to Moses, make sure that you don't eat the blood because the blood is indicative of life. And so He prevents Moses and the people of Israel from eating the blood because it's indicative of life. You don't have that all developed here in Genesis 9, but I think the principle is still there in Genesis 9, even though it's not fully stated that way, that the reason you shouldn't eat blood itself, that doesn't mean if there's a little bit left in the meat, the flesh, that's okay, but it's the drinking of the blood, it's the eating of the blood, the consuming of the blood that God prohibits, because it carries, in a sense, the life of that animal. And so that's why, this is the bottom of page 4, this is why there needed to be sacrifices where blood was shed. Right? So the animal needed to bleed out and die. It couldn't just bleed. It needed to bleed out and die because the shedding of blood is indicative of death. And death was required for a sacrifice. So That's what God is talking about in Leviticus 17. He's describing the sacrificial system. Those animals needed to die. Their blood needed to be shed. And obviously you can see the picture here of Christ. This is all pointing ahead to Christ. So Jesus couldn't just prick his finger on the cross and bleed a little bit. He needed to die because the blood represents life. And death occurs when the blood is shed. So that's the reason for the prohibition or the restriction here that God gives to Noah, because blood is associated with the life of an animal. It's not to be consumed as food.
Aren't all diseases carried in the blood, though, too? I mean, would it be a protection in that way?
It could be. Yeah, there could be a hygienic effect to that as well. I wouldn't doubt that. But I think primarily it's the symbolism of the life being poured out. Very quickly here, so does that mean you can't get a blood transfusion? As Jehovah's Witnesses claim, no, it doesn't mean that at all. Because getting a blood transfusion is not the same thing as eating blood. Very different processes. So Jehovah's Witnesses and others who claim that you can't get a blood transfusion on the basis of this text are misinformed. There's no biblical basis anywhere for not taking a blood transfusion. So we'll stop here. We have to talk about the death penalty and capital punishment in verses 5, 6, and 7, but we'll save that for next time. And so no class next week.
Thanksgiving, we can eat meat. Yay.
Yeah. Eat your turkey to the glory of God.
And you can have a salad on the side.
And have a salad for good measure.
Omnivore.